Hi friends, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Here's what we're discussing today. If you were around at the turn of the century in 2000, in that time frame, you may have recalled a news story or two about a murder that occurred out in California, a murder of Laci Peterson and her son, Connor, allegedly done by Scott Peterson, who was her husband. Now, Scott Peterson has been back in the news following a motion made by his new defense counsel from the Los Angeles Innocence Project. And while they share the name of the Innocence Project, that the group that essentially pioneered DNA as a means of overturning convictions, they are in fact a separate entity from the Innocence Project. Before we get to the claims made, it's important to remember the story. Scott Peterson was a fertilizer salesman, and his wife, Laci, was a substitute teacher at a local school. They had been married for several years and were living in Modesto, California, at the time of the events in the case, and their first child, a young man that they were going to name Connor when he was born, she was pregnant with that child. So that was the situation on Christmas Eve in 2002. Now, according to him, Scott Peterson took out his new boat out on San Francisco Bay on Christmas Eve in 2002. And then, when he came home, he stated that his pregnant wife was nowhere to be seen. So he filed a missing persons report. Scott, however, was both a philanderer and a liar. In other words, he sold a different kind of fertilizer. He had told a massage therapist he was sleeping with that he was a widower, and she apparently thought that they had a future. Well, when Laci went missing, there was a lot of publicity around it. Posters were put up, and everybody knew that this young lady, this mom, was missing. And at that point in time, Amber Fry, who was this massage therapist down in Fresno, came forward at a police news conference and said she was having an affair with Scott Peterson. She said the affair began in November after Peterson told her that he was single. Laci was still missing, and nobody knew where she was. One of the things that Amber did when she came forward was that she agreed to record certain phone calls made by Scott Peterson. On April 18th, about 4 months after the information came out about Amber Fry, the California Attorney General, Bill Laci, confirmed that a body found April 13th on the shore of San Francisco Bay was that of Connor, the infant. And another body found on April 14th was that of Laci. Now, the body of Laci was headless, and both forearms were removed, likely to prevent identification. On April 18th, Peterson was arrested in San Diego, pending capital murder and double homicide charges, and he was held without bail. Interestingly enough, up to that point, they had no physical evidence that tied him to the murder. So he was arraigned on April 21st of 2003, and at his arraignment he was charged with two felony counts of murder with premeditation and special circumstances, and he pleaded not guilty. An up-and-coming lawyer by the name of Mark Garagos signed on as his attorney in May, and in June, because of the great deal of press and publicity that the case was receiving, the judge in the case placed a gag order on the participants, saying the restrictions were necessary, basically to preserve Peterson's right to receive a fair trial and to blunt some of the leaks and the publicity that were coming out related to the story. If you have never been around a really important local story, it is hard to really communicate what goes on. I was a lawyer involved in the Robert Courtney case in Kansas City. And that happened in 2001, right about the same time some of this happened. And the interesting thing about that case was that the news media, all of the local TV stations put reporter after reporter on it. We would get phone calls 2 and 3 and 4 a day saying, what can you give me? I'll protect you as a source. Just give me the juicy details. And of course, lawyers are bound by an ethical obligation as officers of the court not to make statements in public that might influence a jury panel. And we knew that we were going to have a jury trial in that case, and so our firm never made a peep about any of this. I think sometimes other people may have been guilty of pushing a little bit of information off to the press, but it wasn't something that we did, and it's not something I would ever do, because I really like my law license, and I would hate to see it taken away from me because I had been stupid. But the reason why they put this gag order in place, of course, is because those news people will hound the people involved to get just one little thing that they can say that's different than the other channels or the other newspapers. And that creates a great deal of stress, not only on the lawyers, but also on the family members of the victim. All of those people have this gag order that affects them, and they can't talk about it. And the press just generally does not respect that. And technically, they don't have to. They can ask. But if you tell, that's where you get into trouble. So on August 18th of 2003, the judge in the case essentially said we're not going to have any cameras in the courtroom. The criminal trial was moved to San Mateo County. And there, the judge did the same thing. He barred the cameras from the courtroom. In March of 2004, so quite a while after the events in issue, the jury selection began. There was a 6-woman, 6-man jury that was seated, and there were 6 alternates. The trial started in June, and on June 21st, the judge told the jurors that they had to be sure that their actions in and around the courtroom were not misconstrued, because one of the jurors, juror number 5, had spoken to Laci's brother, Brent Rocha, at the courthouse security checkpoint on June 18th. That juror was later dismissed from the jury. Then in August, in the trial, Fry testified that Peterson told him he was a widower and that he lied about where he lived and where he traveled. The jurors heard recordings of Peterson and Fry's conversations made by police after she discovered the truth. The jury got the case in November of that year, and on November 12th, Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for Laci's death and second-degree murder for Connor's death. And then in December, after a penalty phase, because in a capital case you have the guilt phase, is the guy guilty or innocent of the crime? Then you have the penalty phase, should he receive the death penalty or life in prison without parole? Well, given that this was his wife and his son, the jury recommended that Peterson be sentenced to death. So the judge followed that recommendation in March of 2005 and entered a death penalty certification and sentenced him to death. Growing out of a concern that there were death penalty cases that had not been arrived at strictly fairly and not in strict respect of their rights, Governor Newsom in 2019 issued a moratorium on executions, and that included Peterson. And then, in August of 2020, California's Supreme Court overturned the death sentence. They remanded it to a lower court to determine Peterson's penalty. And then the Supreme Court ordered the San Mateo County Superior Court to re-examine Peterson's murder convictions because the juror did not disclose involvement in other legal proceedings, including but not limited to being the victim of a crime. And that latest ruling was part of an ongoing appealed case. So Peterson was resentenced to life without parole in October of 2022. Now, Peterson's attorneys in April of 2023 filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus, in which they alleged that there were violations of state and federal constitutional rights and a state statutory rights claim, including a claim of actual innocence that is supported by newly discovered evidence. The LA Innocence Project entered its appearance in January of 2024 and said it was investigating that claim of actual innocence. And then this month, on March 12th, a hearing was scheduled and new motions relating to additional evidence and DNA testing were filed, and the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced it was going to take on the case. So, what are the claims of actual innocence that are being made here? Well, according to Peterson's counsel, the LA District Attorney withheld exculpatory evidence. Apparently, there was a burglary in the neighborhood where Laci was living shortly before or near the time when she went missing. The defense theory is that the burglars believed she saw them and decided to take her out. The defense wants DNA evidence from the crime scenes, meaning not only the Peterson home, but also, and anything that's been preserved from the original case, but also the DNA, I believe, from the burglary, if there is any. And what they are going to try to stitch together is this theory that there is a viable theory of defense. There is new evidence that they didn't know about. They apparently did not know about the burglary. Maybe they don't read the newspaper. I don't know. But they filed this motion with over 800 pages of exhibits, and then they promptly sealed those exhibits, so we have no idea what is in them. Now, here's the problem. To believe the defense theory that this is exculpatory, you have to stack multiple assumptions on top of multiple coincidences. First, you have to assume that there is some relationship between the burglary and Laci Peterson. To my knowledge, there is no real link between those two. And those two are probably independent of each other anyway, and are unlikely to be related simply because burglars don't tend to be murderers, and they don't tend to hide bodies. If there is a murder that is committed in a burglary, usually it's because somebody resists, somebody panics, fires a gun, and then when that happens, everybody grabs whatever loot they have and hightails it out of there. Well, in this case, to believe the theory, you have to think that first, they picked a day when they knew Scott Peterson was going to be out boating to murder the mom and her child. So how would they know that? Hard to say. Second, you have to believe that they cared enough about keeping her body from being identified and linked back to Scott Peterson, because it wouldn't have been linked back to them, that they cut the head off and cut the arms off the body. Then you have to believe that that's just a coincidence that they happened to throw the body in the same bay where Peterson went boating on the same day, and that these burglars are well enough off financially to have a boat suitable for ocean going and body dumping. That's a whole lot of assumptions you have to make in order to believe this theory. Mostly it doesn't make sense. But even the tiny thread of a theory like this is enough probably to get discovery, and it's certainly enough to get DNA if there is, any DNA that remains, and access to the physical evidence. They will hire investigators, they will go behind the police, and they will do what they can to find what they need if it's possible, and they will try and stitch together a theory to get him a new trial on these issues. Will that be successful? My thinking is it probably won't be successful, but again, if you believe in our system, you have to believe that it is just as important to justice to get an innocent person out of jail as it is to put a guilty person in jail. And if that's the case, if there is even a scintilla of evidence that this is a wrongful conviction, then it needs to be overturned, and they need to have a second go at a trial. So that's what I have for you today. Now, one thing that I want to point out is that I'm not sure where things are in your neck of the woods, but in my neck of the woods on April 1st, the United Way campaign will kick off. One of the best jobs I ever had for a summer was being a loaned executive for the United Way. And I went around telling people all of the things that the United Way and its many organizations did to benefit people. At the time, I was living in Quincy, Illinois, and Quincy, Illinois has a very active United Way, and the campaign that year was being run by the president of the hospital where I worked, and I was chosen to donate, numerous hours of my time to go out and essentially make speeches. And I talked about having to deal with infants that were badly harmed by domestic abuse. And I championed one of the agencies that was supported by United Way, which was called QANADA. It was the Quincy Area Network Against Domestic Abuse. And that Quincy Area Network Against Domestic Abuse would house women and children who had to come out of their home because some spouse had gone off the deep end. I felt like that was a very worthwhile thing for me to do, and I almost wish I could do it again here in Florida or Lee County, because it is such an important thing to help protect those people who need to be protected. So, on behalf of your local United Way and all of the many things that they do to help people, I'm going to ask you to consider supporting the United Way Combined campaign this year, because it's the right thing to do. It's a good way to donate and do a lot of good among a lot of different people, and it's something you can feel good about all year. Again, that's what I have for you. Thank you so much for watching. And if you would, please come back and catch me down here at the beach again next time. Have a great day. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.